recent events in Palestine have underscored for many people the gravity of the situation that is too often off the media radar unless extraordinary and horrific events are taking place. But they have taken place there with disturbing regularity and continue to do so. Our next guest has covered events in Palestine and Israel for many years. Max Blumenthal is the senior editor of the Greystone Project and is a documentary filmmaker. His latest film, co-produced with Dan Cohen, is entitled Killing Gaza. We will be talking about that and the situation in Palestine in this segment. So first of all, let me welcome you back to the program, Max.
Great to be back.
And secondly, we'll start out by, if you're watching the program on Free Speech TV, or YouTube, seeing a trailer for the program. If you're listening on the radio, of course, you will hear the narration of the trailer. So let's go to that now.
July 2014. Israel invades Gaza. Everything was a target. 100,000 homes destroyed. Towers bombed. 551 children killed. After 51 days, the war ended, but the terror continued. Deprivation, exclusion, a grinding siege with no end. We followed the people of Gaza during the war and throughout its devastating aftermath, watching from the ground as they kept up their resistance. Coming soon, a film on life under siege and the killing of Gaza.
So that's the film, Killing Gaza. Let's start out by asking, Max, this was obviously several years in the making. It's covering the events of 2014. What was the history of the creation of this film?
Well, I went into the Gaza Strip on August 14th, 2014 with my co-producer, Dan Cohen. We just had a small camera, had no idea we were going to make a documentary. It was the sort of entering the final phase of Israel's 51-day war on the Gaza Strip. And we got into Gaza right as a 5-day ceasefire began. So people who had been living in shelters were able to come back to their homes, which were no longer homes. They had been reduced to rubble in many cases. These are the homes in the border areas bordering Israel that had been blanketed by Israeli artillery, missiles, tank shells, etc. And we just walked through the rubble day after day, interviewing people. We found, all kinds. It was like walking through a crime scene, and we would find, boxes of Israeli ammunition and maps and battle plans, and speak to people about atrocities that they had witnessed. In many cases, people were still finding dead bodies. And that's when we decided we should really make this into a documentary film. And so that took place over the course of 2 weeks, a week, the final week of the war, and then a week after the war. I chronicled a lot of this in my book, The 51-Day War. And then Dan Cohen was able to get credentialed for a year from the Israeli government to enter Gaza. And so, the whole Western press corps had left, and he continued to return to follow a lot of the characters we met and show how they had been sort of psychologically impacted by the war and what it was like living under siege as reconstruction just never took place. The conditions worsened to unprecedented levels. And as we continued filming, and I decided that we should guide the film kind of away from being a chronicle of war to more an intimate portrait of what it's like being in the suffocating atmosphere of siege. And I think what we've done is kind of lifted the cover on one of the most difficult places to access in the world and show what Israel, the U.S., and also our ally in Egypt have done to the people in Gaza, as told by those people themselves. We don't really interject ourselves into the film except for a few brief voiceovers to provide some context.
So, first of all, you mentioned, you used the analogy of a crime scene, finding evidence as in a crime scene. It is a crime scene according to international law, isn't it? I mean, was this military assault on Gaza permissible under international law or a violation of it?
I mean, it was pretty clear that Israel was deliberately targeting civilians if you consider that 100,000 homes were destroyed. Most of them were destroyed in the course of a few days. But, you know, having been there during some of the bombing, you know, they were bombing entire family homes because maybe they considered one of the family members or several of the family members to be members of Hamas, or they would say it's a terror family. And then, you know, you'd see the Bach family, for example, the patriarch, the father of the family, was the police chief of Gaza City. The government of Gaza is controlled by Hamas. They were elected in 2006 legislative elections. And he's just a police chief. 30 or so, about 24 members of that family were killed in that one airstrike. They knew those people were in the house, and it was all to get the police chief. And one journalist I spoke to who went to the scene, this was before I entered Gaza, said that he found when he got there that there were arms dangling from trees, and he found fingers on the ground. It was like, that's what it was like. And you know, this is a clear violation of the Geneva Conventions, which forbids the targeting of civilians. And Israel actually does not consider people in the Gaza Strip to be civilians. They even have a military ethicist, an ethicist. I don't know how you can have a military ethicist in-house. He's a professor at Tel Aviv University named Asa Kasher, and he said that there are no civilians in Gaza. There is only the terrorist's non-dangerous neighbor. And that's so they can wriggle out of the Geneva Conventions in their own internal investigations and say, well, we did nothing wrong because there was so terrorists nearby.
Well, but and I don't want to get lost in that. I want to stay on the film. But
yeah,
my understanding of international law is that that construct, the idea of somebody near a terrorist, the phrase you just used, that's not something that exists in international law. Civilians are civilians, combatants are combatants. There's no third category of civilians who are near combatants that can be targeted. Is there, or am I missing something?
Well, I mean, I'm not going to lie. This film, Killing Gaza, is difficult to watch, especially the opening section on the war. You can see it at killinggaza.com. You can rent it for $3 and see for yourself. But you know, we try to avoid showing too much. You know, kind of what you could call snuff footage. This is the first war where you could really see a lot of that because people had cell phone cameras. But there was one incident where we couldn't avoid this incident because we had access to the family of the victim, Salam Shamali. And many people who followed the war closely might even remember his killing because it was videotaped by someone we knew in the Gaza Strip who we worked with. He was searching for his cousin in the rubble of Shujaiya, which is outside Gaza City, one of the worst hit areas. His cousin was wounded in a house, and he went with a team of international volunteers. Our scene in the film is actually narrated by one of the volunteers, Joe Catron, who's a friend of ours. So he's with a bunch of Western volunteers. He's dressed like I'm dressed right now, and he walks into the rubble, and someone's filming with a cell phone camera, and he's shot by an Israeli sniper. It's all captured on footage. He was targeted and shot just walking down the street, and then he's laying on the ground and he's pleading for help. He's shot again, and then he's sort of immobilized, and then the soldier provides the kill shot, and it's all on camera, and he's surrounded by volunteers who are marked as medical, you know, rescue workers. This is what happened in the rubble, and we saw it very clearly, and this is quite clearly a war crime, a crime against humanity. One of countless incidents. And we met the family of Salam Shamali a few weeks, maybe 2 weeks after this took place. They said that they couldn't get to his body for a week, and when they found it, it had been moved because the spot where he had been killed had been bombed again. And so his corpse was bombed. And they couldn't find a place to bury him because the graveyards were all full. His younger brother breaks down in tears. Wasim Shamali, he's 15 at the time, and he was almost catatonic. Dan Cohen was able to go back to Gaza and visit with Wasim months after this incident took place. He's growing up. He's reflecting back on the war. He takes Dan to the cemetery where his brother's buried, and he says, I have no way of recovering my dignity and no way of finding justice There's no justice for us here. The only recourse I have is to become a fighter. And so I would like to join the Al-Qassam brigades, the military wing of Hamas. And so what you see is, not just Israeli war crimes, but you see what it does to people as human beings. And I think his response was a very human response for someone who's been denied any justice. And it's to seek revenge. And he said, all of my friends are taking the same path because their relatives have been killed. They watch their friends blown to bits. And they want to hold on to their dignity as people. Nothing about religion, about messianism, about killing the Jews. It was just this pure human response that I think Americans would have if they faced the same situation.
This may seem like an incongruous thing to bring up, but of all people, I saw George Carlin trying out new material shortly before he died at a small club in Long Beach, California. And he was trying out material for an upcoming HBO special. And he had a whole segment that didn't make it into the HBO special where he talked about terrorism. And he didn't name any place in the world, but he said, if people came to your home, to your village, to your town, and started shooting people and started killing people because they didn't like who they were associated with or who their brother was, who their cousin was, who their son was, and if that happened long enough, George Carlin, of all people, said, I don't know any American who wouldn't pick up a gun at some point and shoot back. So when you talk about a human response, even leaving aside, someone's going to write me now and say, well, you're endorsing terrorism or violence. I think what I'm really saying, and I think what George Carlin was saying, and I think perhaps what you're saying, is it's a totally expected and a comprehensible response, that you can't be surprised when this happens, and that if in fact your objective is to reduce the level of violence in an area, this is exactly the opposite of what you would do.
Yeah, and also, I mean, what is terrorism? The Al-Qassam brigades primarily killed Israeli soldiers during the war who were invading the Gaza Strip. I think 67 of the 72 Israelis who were killed were soldiers who were invading the Gaza Strip. The Al-Qassam brigades functioned as a military unit as best as they could, and they had even the opportunity to attack Israelis because they penetrated Israeli territory through tunnels, and instead they attacked the military base at Nahal Oz on camera and actually killed several Israeli soldiers in a base that was used as a forward position against Gaza to launch attacks. There is a kibbutz attached to that base, near that base. They could have gone into the kibbutz and killed people. They went to the base, which is a much harder target. So, I mean, I would call into question the, terrorism is killing civilians to achieve a political goal. And, in this case, in this war, and it really was a war, of course, it was a very lopsided war. The military factions in the Gaza Strip were doing the best they could to target soldiers and combatants. Israelis were doing quite the opposite and were targeting the civilian population. They have a doctrine called the Dahiya doctrine, which is to target the civilian population, to demoralize them to the point that they'll turn against their leadership and simply give up. And it's what they're planning. They tested it on the Lebanese and then implemented it in Gaza. And this war was the most extreme demonstration of the Dahiya doctrine. And what we do with killing Gaza is really get up close and intimate with people who have lived under the Dahiya doctrine almost in a defenseless position, get in their faces and let them explain what it's like. And, whatever you think about Israel-Palestine, you listen to what these people have to say and then get back to me, because there's no way you're not going to relate to them. And I would especially say that to, Texans and, conservative, gun-loving conservatives. What would you do if a foreign army came, occupied you and took your land and put you in a human warehouse and then demanded that you either suffer or turn on your elected leadership? Would you pick up guns and fight? Because most of the people in the Gaza Strip actually don't pick up guns and fight. And that's the other thing that we show in this film, is that the resistance, the forms of resistance that most of the people we met prefer are creative and peaceful. We met painters like Malak Matar, who is this At the time we met her, she was 16, and she had basically holed up in her room throughout the whole war as bombing is going on all around her, and taught herself to paint and became this incredibly talented painter who's now able to travel and show off her paintings, and that was her dream. We met the Camp Breakers, who were the first breakdancing crew in the Gaza Strip, and we show them kind of breakdancing in the rubble of Shujaiya, but you know, they are dedicated to this craft, and they're not able to compete they haven't been able to compete in international competitions and perfect their moves and learn from other b-boy crews because of the siege. They're finally able to get out, and who knows if any of these people will be able to go back to their families. And then we also spent time, Dan got into a training camp of the Nasser Salahuddin Brigades, which is an armed resistance faction, and talked to some of the young people and asked them why they joined. And again, it's the same response. They're killing our families. We have no rights. It's not about, you know, any religious messianism or anti-Semitism. That's not what comes out. And these were completely candid interviews that I think you really just won't get anywhere else. So just watch the film and decide for yourself.
And again, we're talking with Max Blumenthal, co-producer with Dan Cohen of the film Killing Gaza, available at killinggaza.com. So Max, I know somebody is listening right now or watching right now and thinking, yeah, but what about what happens to Israelis, you know, the other side kind of argument. So let's just talk about that for a second. Is there comparable loss of life or instilling of fear across the other side in Israel?
I think during the 2014 war, there were 5 civilian casualties or so. I mean, compared to 2,200 on the side of Gaza, 551 children were killed in Gaza. I visited a doctor in Khan Yunis with Dan, and he showed us the ice cream cooler that they had to use to store the corpses of babies during the war because they had run out of space in their mortuary, and he had to put adult body parts in meat lockers nearby. So that was the situation in Gaza compared to Israel. Towards the end of the war, a stray mortar shell killed a child in Israel named Daniel Tregerman, who was living on a kibbutz hard against the Gaza border. And the Israelis demanded a harsh response because their child had been killed. One of theirs had been killed. And so Benjamin Netanyahu and the military commanders ordered the destruction of 3 or 4 major civilian residential towers in Gaza City, and the main tower that was home to Gaza's media offices. So as if you know, a foreign army came and bombed the headquarters of, you know, Thomson Reuters in the middle of New York City, or the CNN building in Atlanta, along with, you know, 2 major residential towers. I don't know if Americans remember when 2 towers came down at any point from a foreign terror group, but that would have probably traumatized them. That happened towards the end of the war as revenge for this child's death. So, you know, that shows the lopsided power dynamic, but we also have to consider what Gaza is. 70 to 80% of the people there are refugees from what is now Israel. It's a human warehouse. They're not able to leave for the most part unless they go through this really Byzantine and painful bureaucratic process, and then often they can't come back. They're being held from the sea. The fishermen can't go more than 3 kilometers out to sea without being shot at by Israeli cruiser ships. A boat of wounded Gazans and cancer patients 2 days ago was stopped on its way to Cyprus. They were trying to get treatment and hijacked, and everyone on the boat was arrested. They're held in by land by electrified fences. There are turrets on some of the walls that I've seen, which are literally remote-controlled machine guns. This has been reported in Haaretz. I couldn't believe it. And you saw the Great Return March, where 62 people, protesters, were killed in one day. The Israeli cadences, Hamas, Hamas, Hamas. These are just like young men that I met all across the Gaza Strip that have no recourse but to charge into these the fences that have been preventing them from having a future. And now Israel's greatest fear because it really doesn't fear rockets anymore. It doesn't fear tunnel infiltrations, is burning kites. That's what they're freaking out in Israel about, because some of the protesters have been putting incendiary devices on kites, and it's burned like a few hectares of Israeli farmland. But consider like the danger of living in the Gaza Strip to burning kites. The greatest threat to Israel, of course, is the fact that these people want to return, that they have claims under UN Resolution 194 to land and titles inside Israel, and that if they come back, they would demand, and they had equal rights, that would be the end of the Jewish state. So it's really about, that's what the Gaza Strip is. It's the price of a Jewish state. And we would have similar things in the United States, and we kind of do if we would officially declare the U.S. a white and Christian nation. So I don't see how it's possible to be liberal and justify the perpetuation of human warehousing and violent demographic engineering, which is what Gaza is the product of.
Well, one of the things I think Killing Gaza is addressing, and I think there are two dimensions to this problem for Americans. One is I think we as a nation don't tend to see the people of Gaza as people, and I'm speaking kind of liberal America, that we often don't see or think of the people of Gaza as people because, first of all, we don't see them in the media, by and large. The mainstream media just doesn't cover. I mean, there'll be an article or two, but the enormity of what's going on there is not covered. The enormity of the tragedy, by and large, is not covered. That's problem number one. Problem number two, and this is the one I will more want your thoughts on, is that I think the enormity of the tragedy, it is so sad, it is so inhumane, it is so painful that I think there's a problem of a limit of absorption. It's almost like empathy overload that people just can't process. Liberal, good-minded people can't process the enormity of what's going on or the enormity of the implications for what that might mean for the politicians they support, whose statements they look the other way at, for the policies they support, that it's the light is too bright to look at directly. Do you know what I'm trying to say?
I definitely know what you're trying to say, and that question is one that I had to confront when I was much younger, and I kind of had this liberal Zionist mentality instilled in me, where I believed that Israel could still make peace and that the U.S. could be a broker in all of it. And, you now have to kind of conclude that there is no peace process. There's just a process where Israel takes piece after piece after piece. And you have to, really look and stare the situation in the face, stare the crisis in the face. And I think that's what we force people to do with this film, Killing Gaza, is just provide them with the starkest image, not only of the situation on the ground, but of the contradictions of the West, because we claim that we're exporting democracy, that we're a force for good in the world. And what you see here is that we are enforcing a totalitarian rule on millions of people simply because they're of the wrong ethno-religious group. You can't compartmentalize that and say, well, this politician justified it, but they're good on Medicare. No, I mean, they're willing to sell out millions of people and defend an apartheid system perhaps because they believe in it. I believe Chuck Schumer has some personal commitment to Israel. Elliot Engel has some personal commitment to Israel, and they identify with it, but also because they are corrupted by pro-Israel money. And whatever the case is, it corrupts that politician absolutely, and the Democratic Party is corrupted absolutely by its support for Israel. And so and the United States, its role in the world, you have to call that into question. You can't just compartmentalize Israel-Palestine and say, well, maybe we could export democracy to Eastern Europe and do some good things in Latin America. Palestine is really the heart of the issue, and I don't see Israel as uniquely evil. I see Israel as a mirror of the supposedly liberal democratic West. I see it as the most severe vision of ourselves and what we're actually becoming as we're confronted with our own contradictions against refugee crises and immigration waves that we've created by destabilizing other countries.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and I think that certainly in terms of Israel-Palestine and perhaps in other areas as well. Look, I was raised also with a tradition of liberal Zionism, and I found that there were, coming to the conclusion I've come to about that situation, there were many off-ramps that, to avoid it, that I explored. I'm just being perfectly candid here myself. And off-ramp number one is both sides do it. And then you start to see the disproportionality. Off-ramp number two, you know, might be the alternative is even worse. Off-ramp number three is just tuning it out. And I think a lot of people do that. I can't deal with it. You know, it's just too much. Off-ramp number four is I don't like the implications of any kind of boycott strategy because that seems undemocratic or antithetical to free exchange of ideas. I mean, there are
Off-ramp number five, there is no gay pride parade in Gaza. You know,
right.
You can come up with endless excuses for denying the basic dignity and rights of a group of people because they don't live up to your standards. I mean, you can come up with endless excuses. It's, you know, no more excuses. Like, we've watched year after year after year as Israel says it wants peace and the U.S. says it's a broker, an honest broker, and here comes Donald Trump and he blows it all up in the course of just a few weeks. He exits the Iran deal, sets us on a course for war with Iran, and moves the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, which formalizes the death of the two-state solution, which was always an illusion. But he just throws it in the faces of liberal Zionists, and it's like, are we just going to accept the situation now, or are we going to move in? I would say, I mean, people call it radical. I'd say a more moderate direction, where we just simply say the solution is some form of a binational state where everyone enjoys equal treatment under the law.
Well, you know, I'm glad you brought that up. We only have 4 or 5 minutes left, and this may be too big a topic for 4 or 5 minutes. But I will tell you that the day that the embassy was moved and the day that the 62 protesters were shot, one constant I have felt throughout this entire process is that I've never believed that the Israeli state as it is constituted, that there was any possibility that it would cease to exist or that it might be transformed. Leaving aside the question of whether you think that's a good or a bad thing, I've just never thought that was in the realm of possibility. I felt that after the events of that day and the world's reaction to it, that changed.
Yeah.
I felt that for the first time that people are viewing that state and its behavior in a different way that might lead to the lack of support and its ultimate change or extinction in the future, the way it did in South Africa, the way it did in other regimes around the world. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, there's this paradox where the debate is completely shifted in the West and in the U.S., even in Washington, on Israel-Palestine in a much more rapid way than I expected, while the situation on the ground has shifted in the opposite direction. And it's, you know, Israel's moving so far to the right that it's unrecognizable, and the situation for Palestinians has never been worse. So you have this kind of symbiosis between the catastrophe on the ground and the opening up of the debate in the West. I think, you know, in many ways, in progressive circles, people like me or you have won that debate. There is really no debate anymore in progressive circles. It's like, if you're supporting Netanyahu's Israel, you're a monster. And even evangelicals are younger evangelicals are beginning to debate this and starting to show solidarity with Palestinian Christians. So it's changing here. The question is when that change here and when the debate will actually transform into some kind of policy that will shift the situation on the ground. And right now, the only thing we have is the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. But, you know, films like Killing Gaza, killinggaza.com, you can show it. to your friends who have questions about the situation in your home. You can show it in your community. We're doing a screening here in D.C. at the Palestine Center, which is on Virginia Ave, right by the Kennedy Center, on June 9th. That's on a Saturday at 6 p.m. So there are going to be different screenings. I'm showing it in New York this weekend on Saturday at the International Action Center. So, you know, there are different vehicles for educating people, and I think the more people that we educate and explain the context to, you know, the more chance we have of actually making concrete change on the ground, and we know which direction that change has to go in.
I think that's exactly right. Now, last comment, if I recall correctly, and if I recall correctly from a conversation you had with Chris Hedges, it seems incongruous to bring this up in the context of so much loss of human life. But one of the details that just struck me straight to the heart from your film and from those conversations was the killing of the animals in the little zoo that they tried to create, that somebody created. Just that slight touch of humanity that people wanted to go see animals, monkeys. And,
Yeah.
and to me, it's that kind of thing that can contribute to the shift, just the inhumanity of it all.
Yeah, I mean, people mock, you know, some can mock Westerners when they get upset about the dying dogs in wars or dying zoo animals, and say, oh, you care more about them than humans. But what we did was we went to this zoo, which was the only zoo and amusement center in the Gaza Strip, after it had been bombed by Israel. We get there and there are like monkey carcasses on the ground and lions in their cages who've been driven insane by bombing, gray foxes running around in a circle, which is just a perfect metaphor for what Gaza had become. And we interview the zookeepers, and they talk to us about how much commitment they had made to starting this zoo and how closely they had bonded with these animals. And so it actually shows the humanity of the zookeepers and the people of Gaza. And you see children playing on destroyed playgrounds because it's one of their only play areas. And you can really take a place like the Bissen Amusement Center and Zoo. All the animals have been shipped out. There's no more zoo. You can take a place like that, and it encapsulates the entire situation. And that was one of the most upsetting incidents for me to film, or places for me to film in.
Because zoos and playgrounds are expressions of humanity. And when that's denied, the tragedy can no longer be avoided. So we're going to have to leave it there, but I encourage people to see the film Killing Gaza at killinggaza.com. And Max Blumenthal, thanks as always for coming on the program.
Thanks so much for doing this.